What if everything you thought was love, lavish gifts, whispered voice notes, passionate sex, was actually evidence in a federal sex trafficking case? That's the question at the heart of the explosive courtroom showdown unfolding right now, where the man once hailed as the godfather of hip-hop, Sean Diddy Combs, faces allegations that could shatter not only his legacy, but the entire ecosystem of celebrity power, privilege, and control. Today, the trial took a dramatic turn, as Jane, identified as one of the key accusers in the sweeping federal indictment, was placed under cross-examination. And this wasn't just legal back and forth, this was psychological warfare, emotional excavation, and a high-stakes tug-of-war between two radically different narratives. On one side, a young woman testifying that she was coerced into performing sex acts with other men, sometimes while physically ill, emotionally depleted, and psychologically broken. On the other, a defense team determined to show she was not a victim at all, but an ambitious, willing participant in a toxic relationship that she now regrets, and has been coached by federal prosecutors to reinterpret as criminal exploitation. Defense. Attorney Tenny Garagos came in not swinging, but smiling, disarming, polite, and casually intimate with Jane in a way that made viewers and jurors alike squirm. He didn't scream. He seduced. And in doing so, he introduced a chilling alternative view. That Jane wasn't forced into those infamous hotel nights, but chose them. That the lines between love and abuse, pleasure and coercion, were not red and clear, but blurred, gray, and maybe even mutual. Jane's testimony is crucial, not just for the sex trafficking charges, but as a keystone in the prosecution's RICO case, which accuses Combs of operating a full-blown criminal enterprise under the guise of celebrity culture. According to Jane, Combs's team coordinated travel, arranged payments, and ensured that hotel rooms were set up for nights involving paid sex with other men, often without her full consent, and sometimes while under the influence of ecstasy. But under pressure from the defense, she also admitted to sending love notes, craving his approval, and yes, initiating some of those nights herself. Was it trauma bonding? Was it manipulation? Or was it love turned sour? This case isn't black and white. It's an emotional minefield, and what came out today in court doesn't just challenge our understanding of consent, power, and trauma. It shakes the very foundation of how we view relationships in the age of influence and control. This isn't just a legal battle. It's a cultural reckoning, and it's only just begun. Next, we'll step back into the origins of this tangled affair. How Jane entered Diddy's world, the glamour that masked the danger, and the slow, seductive unraveling of her autonomy. Imagine stepping into a lifestyle so luxurious, so intoxicating it feels like a dream, until you realize the dream is laced with expectations you never agreed to. That's how Jane described the beginning of her relationship with Sean Diddy Combs. Seductive, star-studded, emotionally magnetic. She was 35 when she first got pulled into his orbit, a content creator with her own fashion line and swimwear business. From the outside, it looked like a modern fairy tale, but underneath the sparkle was something far less glamorous, something complicated, and eventually, something dangerous. The defense opened its cross-examination with charm. Attorney Tenny Garagos wasn't confrontational. He was warm, chatty, even flirtatious. You might have mistaken their exchange for two old friends catching up at a dinner party. But make no mistake, this was calculated. He wanted to remind the jury that Jane didn't just wander into Diddy's world. She entered willingly, eyes wide open. And maybe, just maybe, she liked what she saw. In those early days, there was love, there was affection, there were gospel sermons, shared smiles, and texts dripping with infatuation. Jane even testified that she loved being close to him, cuddling, rubbing his feet while they watched his favorite show, D-Line. No red flags, not yet. Then came the voice notes. The jury heard audio messages exchanged between Jane and Diddy during a trip to Turks and Caicos. One of them had Diddy calling her the crack pipe, an odd metaphor he used for their sexual chemistry. "Stay in the light," he told her. "It was so much phenomenal fun. Get in your bag." For Jane, that phrase, "get in your bag," meant something deeper. It was their love contract, a symbolic deal where Diddy would pay her rent and support her financially in exchange for her companionship. Not unusual in Hollywood power dynamics, some might argue, but it planted the first seed of transactional intimacy. She replied with equal enthusiasm, "I love being up under you. I'm so happy. Health is wealth. I love you so much." These were not the words of a coerced woman, the defense insisted. These were the declarations of someone in love. But here's where it gets weird. Despite the emotional bonding, Jane said she never sought out Homeland Security. She didn't walk into a federal building waving a flag of victimhood. It was the prosecutors who came to her. They found her after raids on Diddy's properties in Miami and Los Angeles. They left a business card on her door. She hadn't seen Diddy since August 2024, just before his arrest, and hadn't spoken to him in 8 months. Still, he was paying her rent. Still, he was paying for her lawyer. And still, she stepped forward. Why, the jury must wonder. Why break silence now? This leads us into a question that makes academics and legal theorists sweat. When does power become coercion? Jane said she stayed in the relationship because of the lifestyle, the adoration, the approval. "I didn't break up with him," she admitted. "Of course not." Was it trauma bonding or a toxic love affair? And what about her admission that she didn't feel regret, just resentment? That sentence alone sent chills down the courtroom's spine. Regret implies agency. Resentment implies betrayal. The difference between those words might decide the fate of a billion-dollar empire. But then, another twist. The escort night, after she knew he was being investigated. Jane admitted she still participated. The defense latched onto this like sharks sensing blood. "You chose to be there," they repeated. "You made that decision." Jane replied that it wasn't so simple. She was still processing everything. Her relationship with Diddy, she said, blurred the lines between love and submission. "I just wanted to feel close to him," she explained. And here's where the defense introduced one of its most uncomfortable arguments. If you're doing something willingly for love, even something sexual, even something degrading, is it still coercion? Those unfamiliar characters began surfacing in the transcript like ghosts in a haunted mansion. Names like Bear, who once sent Jane $9,000, Young Miami, who Diddy publicly dated while Jane felt hidden, and even staff members like Courtroom, who would later reappear as possibly knowing more than she let on. But in these early stages, Jane wasn't talking about racketeering or violence. She was reminiscing about affection, addiction, and a longing to be seen. One moment stood out. Jane explained that she was upset not because Diddy had multiple women, but because he was public with one of them, Young Miami. "I didn't sign up to be in a relationship with someone who was public with someone else," she said. The Maybach Diddy gifted Carisha became a symbol not just of wealth, but of hierarchy. Jane wanted one too, not for the money, for the validation. That craving, more than anything else, revealed the psychological power Combs held. But was it all love? Jane's financial standing complicates that. The defense showed she made $50,000 from brand deals. She received $5,700 in monthly child support. She had a lucrative OnlyFans account. "Did you need his money?" the defense asked. "No," she said. "I wanted his approval." And with that sentence, the courtroom collectively paused. Approval, more than sex, more than drugs, more than luxury, was the currency Jane seemed to value most. It's here that the audience must confront another uncomfortable question. Can a person be both victim and accomplice in their own exploitation? Jane admitted to organizing hotel nights. She picked outfits. She sent seductive messages. But she also testified that she often felt sick, hesitant, or even manipulated. The contradiction isn't just confusing, it's traumatic, and yet it's real, especially for victims who confuse pain with passion and control with care. The early environment of Jane and Diddy's relationship wasn't a crime scene. It was a love story, albeit one written in the ink of power, money, and emotional instability. What began as romantic gestures soon blurred into sexual expectations. What began as devotion soon drifted into dependency. This is not just a story of what happened. It's a story of what was allowed to happen and who had the power to define the terms. In the next chapter, we'll pull back the curtain on the machine behind the relationship, the hidden mechanisms of control, the financial levers and the invisible contracts that bound Jane not just emotionally, but logistically and psychologically to the man she once loved. What if love wasn't just blind, but orchestrated? In Jane's cross-examination, what emerged wasn't merely a toxic relationship, but something disturbingly methodical. Behind the whispered "I love yous" and luxury gifts lay a system, structured, sustained, and, according to prosecutors, sinister. This wasn't simply about one woman being emotionally manipulated. This was about a pattern of psychological coercion engineered through financial control, sexual expectation, and silence. From the outside, Jane looked empowered. She had her own swimwear line, brand deals that paid tens of thousands, and a significant child support arrangement. Yet despite this surface independence, her connection to Diddy functioned like a leash, one tug from him, whether in the form of affection, money, or threat. And she came running. The defense tried to frame it as loyalty, but Jane's own words told a different story. I needed his approval, not his money, not his love, his approval. And when approval becomes the currency, control is the bank. Let's talk rent, an expense most Americans dread. Jane didn't pay hers. Diddy did, not just during the relationship, but even months after his arrest. A powerful man funding a former lover's lifestyle sounds like generosity, but the prosecution argued it was a tool, a lever, a way to keep her close, compliant, and conflicted. The strange twist? Jane insisted she hadn't seen or spoken to him in 8 months, and yet he was still covering her housing. Was he dangling it over your head? The courtroom asked. Because if rent becomes a condition for sexual availability or silence, it's not support, it's leverage. And this is where the legal debate intensifies. Can affection, when tied to survival, ever be free? Another odd detail emerged. Diddy, despite his sprawling wealth, allegedly avoided hosting certain parties at his own home, not because of privacy, but because his staff might see. Jane testified that the debauchery, the so-called hotel nights, happened in separate rooms, isolated from his household employees. Why? Possibly to shield them, or to shield himself. Because while assistants were flying people out, arranging hotel keys and managing money they weren't supposed to see, it's a detail that sparks academic debate. If you help build the machine but aren't told what it does, are you innocent or strategically blind? And then there's Christina Courtroom, the chief of staff whose name appears in nearly every testimony like a shadow behind the curtain. Jane recounted text exchanges with Christina that suggest she was more than a glorified scheduler. In one, Jane tells Christina she's shaking after paparazzi photos threaten to expose her relationship with Diddy. Christina's response is casual. There were other people in the frame, she said, don't worry. But in another exchange, Jane describes traveling with a package, drugs she packed in her checked luggage at Diddy's request. Christina reportedly reassured her, I've done this before. Wait, what? A chief of staff admitting to drug trafficking logistics? In a casual text, suddenly what looked like a private affair becomes a coordinated operation. And here's the thing, Jane wasn't comfortable with all the drugs. She admitted to using ecstasy and MDMA, explaining they made her more uninhibited, helped her focus on the sexual moments. She avoided ketamine and cocaine, saying they weren't her thing. But when asked why she continued to participate in hotel nights while intoxicated, her answer wasn't rebellion, it was compliance. "I just wanted to feel closer to him," she said. The line between submission and self-abandonment was dissolving. It wasn't just about sex, it was about identity. She wasn't performing, she was surviving. This invites a bigger question for both courts and culture. When someone says yes under emotional pressure, is it still yes? Jane recalled that Diddy would cater to her during hotel nights, pouring drinks, preparing drugs, laying out lingerie. He wasn't forcing her exactly, but he was setting a scene, a stage, and she played her part, not because she loved the spotlight, but because she feared the dark. Some nights, Diddy would allegedly prepare everything, lingerie, high heels, MDMA, before Jane arrived. Sometimes she would choose the outfits. Sometimes he'd lay them out, like costumes. They called it quality time. But Jane's voice cracked when she said it. That time, she explained, became sacred. The more twisted the routine, the more she craved the parts that still felt romantic. And yet, even in the intimacy, she felt invisible. It's a psychological paradox often described in trauma literature. Attachment to one's abuser is not weakness. It's a coping mechanism. Strange moments kept surfacing. Diddy's behavior with drugs, shaky hands, gray gums, unpredictable moods, suggested someone spiraling. Jane said she once thought he had jaundice. Later, she learned he was on antidepressants, using ketamine therapeutically, partying excessively. She even urged him to go to rehab. On paper, he was her provider. In reality, he may have also been broken. But trauma doesn't excuse crime. It explains behavior. And here, the defense tried to pivot. If Diddy was out of control, how could he orchestrate abuse? But even in chaos, patterns can exist, and one pattern was clear: emotional escalation followed by control. When Jane got too close, Diddy pulled back. When she grew distant, he reeled her in. One particularly disturbing tactic involved money. The defense highlighted that Jane made $50,000 from just 2 brand deals. They suggested she didn't need Diddy's financial help, but Jane said she still felt desperate. Why? Because her value wasn't calculated in dollars. It was measured in Diddy's gaze. When he looked at her, she existed. When he didn't, she disappeared. New characters entered the narrative. People like Bear, a man who once sent Jane $9,000, sparking Diddy's jealousy. Jealousy, another psychological lever. Jane admitted she grew envious of other women, especially young Miami, who received public affection and a Maybach while Jane remained in the shadows. "I got trauma," she said flatly. A haunting line. The other woman got a luxury car. She got a lifetime of questions. As Jane explained all this, her tone shifted. She wasn't just testifying, she was unraveling. She said that being with Diddy made her feel validated, that she orchestrated hotel nights not because she wanted to, but because she believed that's what love required. And here lies the final, disturbing insight of this segment. A system of control doesn't always need bars or threats. Sometimes it only needs affection used like a weapon. Sometimes love is the leash. In the next part, we'll explore how this system of emotional and logistical control led to lasting damage, how Jane's sense of self, safety, and career were torn apart piece by piece, because this wasn't just a relationship, it was a slow-motion collapse, and the pieces are still falling. The morning Jane stepped off the stand after her emotional breakdown, the air in the courtroom changed. Her testimony shifted from theory to lived experience. the concrete cost of survival in a relationship designed to consume her. She spoke of mounting credit card debt, sleepless nights, panic attacks, and a realization that the life she once controlled had slowly unraveled into chaos. One moment she was a confident content creator with a flourishing dress line. The next she found herself maxed out, covered in unpaid bills and drained of self-worth. That was the dawning of her personal fallout. And here's the unexpected twist. Amidst the debris of debt and doubt, Jane admitted that Diddy continued paying her rent. She said, "He still covers it," months after his arrest, an act that felt less like kindness and more like tethering her to his control. Those assistance and text message exchanges echo in the background, reminding us that every bit of support came with strings attached. Let's look at her business. Jane launched swimwear and fashion lines under Diddy's encouragement, even receiving a $20,000 investment from him. On surface, it was generosity, but behind the scenes, when she tried to resist or assert independence, pressure surfaced. She took on OnlyFans content to make ends meet after charging multiple credit cards to their limits. Oddly, the same man who called her the crack pipe and invested in her startup also discouraged her from joining OnlyFans, citing stigma. She took the gig anyway, explained it as necessity, not rebellion. She said, "I needed the money." The contradictory signals reveal a fractured system. Encouragement followed by deterrence, support undercut by shame. The tension between approval and independence churned inside her. And again, the entourage, the lawyers, the staff, all played roles in this push and pull dynamic that trapped her in a cycle of expectation. Emotionally, Jane described herself as a hostage in her own life. She didn't break up with Diddy. She didn't ask for therapy or seek separation. Instead, she stayed, despite chronic exhaustion, despite vomiting after hotel nights, despite drug-induced haze. It wasn't just love. It was entrapment by emotional inertia. Her own words betray this. "I didn't have regret, just resentment." Regret suggests choice. Resentment suggests coercion. And in that resentment, we sense the seeds of ruin. She lost control of her narrative, her finances, her bodily autonomy, even her identity. If she once felt like a content creator, now she felt like a performer in someone else's show. And watch from the wings, framing her for applause or silence. Publicly, Jane knew the stakes. When she was forced to read the graphic text messages describing explicit sex acts and oil-soaked fantasies, her voice shook. She apologized to the court, to the defense attorney, to herself. She said these weren't exhibitionist messages. They were escape, fantasy, survival. Each word she uttered in that courtroom carried the weight of humiliation, being stripped. In public, where millions could read, judge. The transcripts may note a vivid message from November 9th, 2021. "I'm just doing a little shoot. What do you want to do?" But they don't convey the human cost behind speaking that aloud in open court. That moment led to her breakdown, her request for a recess, her collapse. Some called it drama. She called it truth breaking free. And while the judge granted a short break, her career fractures spilled beyond the room. Her online presence suffered. Brand sponsors paused collaborations. Her OnlyFans traffic became a double-edged sword. While it provided income, it also became a target for tabloid scrutiny. She no longer controlled her image, the court did. A woman once defined by glamour now feared that every post, every like would be reinterpreted through the lens of coercion. Each upload risked reopening courtroom wounds. The anxiety of it was real. Loss of privacy, loss of income, loss of dignity. Even her personal life crumbled. Jane testified she fought with jealousy, not just about Diddy's relationships, but about the emotional and financial sacrifices she made. When she saw other women with Chanel bags and Maybachs, she cried, "I have trauma!" A powerful admission. trauma isn't reserved for the physically assaulted. It can stem from emotional extraction, too. That moment shattered the boundary between victim and participant. She broke, not because she was weak, but because she was raw. That cascade of emotion, what the defense tried to label as performance, underscored her humanity. But the fallout didn't end with tears. She struggled with trust, her capacity for romance, and her self-esteem. And here's the weirdest part. The man who bankrolled her lifestyle became the one who bankrupted her sense of self. Academics argue over whether emotional coercion constitutes abuse. Terms like trauma bonding and emotional manipulation get thrown around in seminars. They may not have pulled the trigger, but they programmed the gun. Jane's career was collateral damage, but so was her sense of self. She testified that these experiences left her processing everything to this day, 3 years after the relationship ended. She's still untangling who she was from who she'd become, and that's the Achilles heel of coercion. It doesn't always leave visible scars. It leaves identity wounds. Yet her testimony also speaks to resilience. Despite the financial precarity, maxed cards, paused lines, unstable sponsorships, she pushed back. She joined the OnlyFans platform on her own terms, even though Combs discouraged it. She refused to go silent when prosecutors reached out. She asked for therapy, she asked for protection, she asked for the jury's attention. She didn't simply collapse under the weight of loss, she redirected it. She reclaimed her narrative bit by bit. Still, the fallout continues. Sponsor conversations are paused. Social media engagement is cautious. Opportunities filtered through the prism of her courtroom narrative. This isn't just damage, it's reputation deflation. And yet, it's also a revelation. Jane is no longer just a woman in a case. She's emerging as a symbol of what happens when glamour becomes a cage, when fame becomes financial bondage, when intimacy becomes invisible trauma. Diddy's staff, the assistants, the text threads, remain in the periphery as ghostly reminders of what helped build and maintain the system. Whether they step forward or stay silent, their roles remain under scrutiny. But as Jane stands in the aftermath, she's preparing to enter the next phase, speaking out not just for herself, but to challenge the systems that turned love into leverage. In the final part, we'll explore why she chose to speak now, under oath in public, and what message she and other survivors hope to send. That even when you've lost your voice, speaking can be the first step toward reclaiming your life. Stepping back into the courtroom today, Jane held her head high. She appeared quieter than before, composed, determined, a woman not just telling her story, but invoking a reckoning. She didn't enter this trial looking for fame or money. She entered seeking closure and perhaps justice. Jane testified today that she didn't chase federal agents or demand attention. Prosecutors reached out to her after Homeland Security left business cards on her door following raids at Diddy's Miami and Los Angeles properties. That sudden knock changed everything. And here's the shocker. She never intended to testify until she realized the depth of what had happened, physically, emotionally, logistically. It wasn't about sensational headlines. It was about the truth. This brings us to an unexpected twist. As she spoke, Jane revealed that she was granted immunity for her grand jury testimony. She didn't ask for it. She didn't demand it. The government offered it because they needed her to complete the mosaic of this alleged criminal enterprise. But that immunity also carried weight. It meant she had to speak, fully and honestly, without fear of self-incrimination. It was protection, yes, but also a mandate to bare her soul. All the assistants, the staffers, the backstage operators, they watched as she spelled out the system of control, the abuse, the coercion. And their knowledge, their silence, was now part of the record. Jane described how prosecutors and agents approached her. They relayed she had the right to say no, to refuse any request, to step back, yet she stayed. She stayed because, she said, parts of her needed clarity. Parts of her needed to know why she stayed in the relationship long after it stopped feeling consensual, why she continued to book hotel nights with men she barely knew, why she suppressed her doubts and vanished in exhaustion, only to return because she hoped, foolishly, that returning meant healing or at least repair. And somewhere along that pathway, love became a weapon instead of a refuge. The courtroom hushed as she recounted being told she wasn't a villain. She wasn't a willing accomplice. She was a victim. Someone caught in the way men of power sometimes build invisible cages around affection. It wasn't an accusation of public scandal. It was a plea for understanding. Consent is not always voluntary, and coercion is not always physical. That distinction matters. In law school, debates, and scholarly articles, professors dissect whether economic pressure qualifies as coercion. Again, the economic agents, the rent, the brand deals, the financial ties, were all now being recontextualized as mechanisms of control, not just luck or generosity. Then came the voice notes. The jurors heard the early romantic ones: sweet talk, glamorous trips, intimacy. The defense pointed to them as proof she was complicit, but Jane reframed them in today's testimony. They were love notes, she said. I still love him, and part of me always will. But what was love became leverage. That admission hung in the air. Love transformed into control. What began as permission began as prison. That evolution is painful, and her admission of lingering feelings amid firm testimony complicates the narrative. It isn't black and white. It's emotional realism, careful yet vulnerable. It's the kind of complexity legal systems struggle to measure, but survivors live every day. Those who examined her cross-examination on today's court feed noted her composure. Some called it resilient poise. Others saw it as the toll of reliving trauma publicly. But make no mistake, Jane chose to return. She chose to stand firm. She said she didn't come to shame Diddy. He's not here, she answered when asked. She came for the bigger battle, to help others spot the signs of someone promising love in exchange for silence or submission. She said she wanted justice, but what she really meant was clarity. She wanted a moment where love with strings could be named, where dependency could be seen, where even subtle coercion would no longer hide behind Instagram filters. Now, a bizarre part. Jane admitted that she paused therapy at one point because being on the stand triggered her trauma so intensely. She had flashbacks. She felt dissociated. But then she said, saying it all out loud was the hardest beginning of my healing. She didn't want this platform, this trial. She wanted a chance to wake up each morning without the weight of unspoken guilt. In those court moments, she said, she felt small justice. Her voice recognized. She was no longer invisible in her own story. Family, friends, colleagues of hers are now stepping forward too. She's inspired them. Some have reached out to share their own stories of silent coercion, loans converted into obligations, affection turned into allowance, intimacy masked as instruction. Jane's testimony, she hopes, will normalize these stories, that they could be seen not as private shame, but as public proof that coercion can wear couture, can live in luxury. It doesn't shout. It seduces. That awareness, she says, is the beginning of change. The courtroom buzzed when Jane revealed that, as part of her immunity deal, she was free to step down from the stand any time. But she didn't. She stayed. She said, I wasn't forced to testify. In that simple statement lies her greatest assertion, reclaiming control. In a relationship built on manipulation, stepping into a courtroom of power, under oath, she reclaimed sovereignty over her own narrative. The defense tried to dismiss her motivations, saying prosecutorial pressure shaped her testimony. But Jane's voice rarely wavered. She said she wasn't coerced by prosecutors. She was coerced by love turned leverage, and in speaking the truth, she dismantled the architecture built around her. The accessories, the staff, the financial strings, they weren't scapegoats. They were instruments, and naming them helps dismantle the system. Today's testimony closed with her message to other survivors. Disorientation in love doesn't cancel your worth. If you feel sick, vomiting, exhausted, overwhelmed, pause. If approval becomes your currency, question whose value you're serving. And if affection begins to define your survival, ask whether you're thriving or simply surviving in someone else's script. It wasn't a plea for pity. It was an invitation for awareness. Jane looked across the courtroom and said she hopes her story sparks change in law, in therapy, in culture. She wants definitions of trafficking and coercion to include emotional extraction, financial manipulation, dependency disguised as devotion. That's her hope for change. After she left the stand, the courtroom reminded us what a testimony can do. Break stigma, expose systems, and shift how we view power. Not by vilifying individuals, but by naming what systems of control look like. In practice, Jane's stand wasn't vengeance, it was revelation. And in doing so, she reminded all of us, speaking out isn't shouting hate, it's whispering truth. And sometimes that's enough to rewire an empire. The courtroom lights dimmed, and Jane stepped away from the stand. What remained in the hushed moment wasn't just a story, it was a reckoning. Over days of testimony, we watched her transform from a woman trapped in a confusing relationship with Sean Diddy Combs to a voice challenging power structures. She bore the burdens of emotional control, financial dependence, and coerced intimacy, yet she also carried something else: clarity. Today's conclusion isn't an end, it's a call to recognize that love, even lavish, media-worthy, influencer-saturated love, can be both sweetest gift and fiercest prison. And sometimes, the moment you admit that is when healing begins. In her last moments on the stand, Jane affirmed what she came to this courtroom to do: not to humiliate, not to shame, but to expose truth. The most powerful revelation? She still painfully loves Diddy. That complicated admission cut deeper than any breakup text. It emphasized a core lesson. Abuse doesn't require hatred. Trauma often lives alongside affection, not in spite of it. That contradiction unsettled the courtroom, reminding us all that human emotions don't fit neatly into categories. They're messy, they're uncomfortable, but they're real. And just when we thought the narrative was tight and tidy, here came a bizarre twist. Jane shared how, even now, she sometimes wakes up halfway through the night, convinced that Diddy still controls her rent, her phone bills, her schedule. That lingering voice of approval, strings attached, though unseen, still echoes. It's strangely surreal. She's free. She's speaking. She's living. But in quiet moments, memories of emotional obligations feel real. Because they are real. Subtle coercions leave marks deeper than bruises. They embed themselves in the mind, shaping how you value yourself. And that's the thing about coercion. Disguised as affection, it's the hardest kind to shake. The troops behind the scenes, not on the witness list, but present in text threads and memory scans. They aren't merely bystanders. Their roles may never reach the stand, yet their presence was felt, coordinating money, promptly relocating unknown men for hotel nights, delivering drugs, engineering illusions. What does it say about a system when the people whose names remain unnamed can shift power without accountability? That's an academic question, yes. But it's also deeply personal for Jane, and for any survivor who learns that abuse doesn't need recognition to flourish. As the attorneys summed up, prosecutors emphasized Jane's turbulence on the stand, her breakdown amid explicit texts, her collapse in tears over Chanel bags, and framed it as raw human response. They argued that emotional moments aren't signs of deceit. They're signs of trauma. The defense argued the opposite. They called it drama. It was theatrical, they claimed, perfection performance. But Jane's final appeal was not to factions or narratives. It was to awareness. She asked the jury and the nation watching to differentiate legal boxes from lived experience. This wasn't about performance. It was about complexity. Here's a shocking truth. Jane doesn't expect everyone to believe every word. She knows trauma stories are inconsistent. They contradict themselves, shift tone, change direction. And yet survivors manage deals with that inconsistency every single day. Marriage counselors call it boundary blur. Psychologists say it's normal brain response to long-term entanglement. Context matters. Understanding that pressure changes perception is not just sympathy, it's accuracy. Her final paradox crashed against the courtroom silence. She called the system both broken and hopeful. She urged legal definitions of trafficking and coercion to consider emotional and economic leverage, not just force. She reminded us that coercion can be leveraged through rent checks and love songs as much as through threats. And she insisted that when a powerful man's affection is conditional and his support serves as leverage instead of compassion, it's time our systems catch up. Another startling truth. Jane's speech closed with gratitude. She thanked the court, the prosecutors, even the defense, because their questions carved her story, piece by painful piece, into light. And she apologized to no one. Not to Diddy, not to fans, not to her critics. She apologized only to herself. For waiting so long to speak, for questioning her own instincts. Her final words on that stand were hers, sharp, clear, unapologetic. She said, "I stand here because speaking is my liberation." This conclusion isn't just for her. It's also for every woman who laughed at a joke that felt controlling, every partner who stayed in hotel rooms they didn't fully want to be in. It's for anyone who sent a sexy text out of love but regretted it later. It's for the survivors lighting up group chats with "Me too" when no TV cameras are rolling. Jane became a mirror, reflecting hidden patterns, unspoken dependency, economic manipulation disguised as romance. And in doing so, she lifted the veil. Still linger in shadows. No amount of reverberation can make us forget them. They're part of her story. But Jane's final act was not to point fingers. It was to show us what it looks like when someone takes back their narrative with cracks and contradictions intact. That's where hope grows. In the broken bones of truth, in lines between shadows, in her final statement. Now the jury goes to deliberate, but long after verdicts, appeals, headlines fade, Jane's words will remain. Speaking is sometimes the first step toward reclaiming your life. Trauma isn't a confession, it's a map, and surviving it is an act of courage. She didn't just testify, she redefined testimony. And for every survivor watching, that matters. It matters a lot.